Imagine being offered absolute power and still walking away. What kind of man does that? Well, someone like George Washington. And to understand what real leadership looked like, I spoke to best-selling author David O. Stewart, who spent years studying the mind of George Washington as he wrote a biography on him. How did one man lead a broken country without breaking himself? And what does it teach us now in 2025? This episode is packed with lessons. You'll hear what happened in the frozen trenches of Valley Forge, how he kept his army loyal when they had no food, how he controlled his temper, and way more. Are you an aspiring leader? Then please take notes. Enjoy. Before we start the episode, I made a list of 100 history books that will completely change your life. The link is in the description, it's completely free, and now let's finally start the episode. So, George Washington, why do you think he's still such an important figure to study, even in 2025?
Well, he was there. It's hard for us to appreciate how dominant a figure he was in American life at the time. Basically, for 20 years, he was the embodiment of the American experiment, and he he respected a lot of the concerns that Americans had at the time. And shared the desire for self-government, for independence. And he won tremendous loyalty. He won the war. And in any society, if you win the war, you're in pretty good shape. People respect that. But then he went on to not be a guy who needed power. And that was an extraordinary quality, and I think stands out in thousands of years of history. That a person who's basically given power then says, well, I'd rather go home. And he did that twice. And it is historians like to say he's one of those unique characters who gained power by turning it down, because people trusted him. He wasn't hankering for the job. He wasn't eager to exercise dominance over people. He just would do his job, and that was a terrific thing. We were extraordinarily lucky to have a figure like that, and not some Napoleonic or Caesar-like character.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is often they say, right, the person who doesn't want the power might be the best person in power. I think that might also be something for him for sure. Is that also what differentiates himself from the founding fathers, the other ones?
Uh, some of them, to be honest. Uh, Hamilton wanted power. John Adams enjoyed it. But there was a respect for some basic principles and tenets of self-government that, and they had rebelled against the king, the person they described as a tyrant. So there was a general attitude of we should not have any single person with with a tremendous amount of power, and that has been an American attitude for centuries. I'm not sure we're still hanging on to it the way we should, but historically, it has been our view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you wrote in your book, he gave up power when he could have taken it. Where did that come from? Like, did he learn that from someone, from a mentor, from a father figure, mother figure? What, what was like the idea behind it?
Uh, Honestly, I think it was him. Uh, he he knew the things he enjoyed, and he wanted not power, but he wanted respect. He wanted to be a leader and to be admired. He worried a great deal about his legacy as he aged. Um, So he was not without a man without ego, but he recognized the toll that power takes. He led the army, and it was not a very impressive army, in a very difficult war for 8 years. And you're sending men to die when you lead an army. It's grinding, and in their winter camps, his soldiers would die just of disease. So you are part of this society-wide effort of sacrifice, and anybody would need a break. And he really did love his home, uh, and he just wanted to go back to it. And I don't think it was ever a hard decision for him. Uh, it's he would have gone 4 years earlier if he could have. So it's again, you often take your leaders as you find them. They tend not to change a great deal. And you know he was a man of great integrity.
Because you also wrote in your book that he was really interested in Roman figures like the Caesars. Um, did he also like look up to them, or did he kind of find them too hungry for power?
Very much too hungry for power. His Roman heroes were those who resisted, characters like Cato, and for our revolutionary generation, Cato was a sort of a social phenomenon. There was a terrible play that had been written about Cato, which was always being produced and performed because his sacrifice for the Roman Republic was so dramatic, and that was what the lesson that uh, the Americans of that generation drew from the Roman example. The emperors were not figures of admiration.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great lesson you learn from history. This is another great example why studying history is so important. Another quote from your book is, he struggled against his nature, suppressing flaws and mastering strengths. So, how important was it to confront personal flaws for him? And what do you think people can learn about Washington's quest for self mastery?
Well, we all go through this, and you take a inventory sometimes every day of what you're doing well and what you're not doing very well. He knew he had a poor speaking voice, and it got worse as he got older because he lost all his teeth, and he had to wear this incredibly unpleasant bridge, a set of false teeth. It was metal, and it was hideous. It's the great tourist attraction in Mount Vernon is to see his false teeth. Um, and he also very much doubted the quality of his education. He had a very limited education, and he was surrounded by people often who were very well educated and very smart and would know 4 or 5 languages. Uh, and that made him modest about his own qualities. And he also knew he had a terrible temper. Um, and that that's something I could identify with. I've spent my life trying to pretend to be patient. And he occasionally lost his temper, and the people who were present described it with awe. It was He was a big man, and a big man as angry is unpleasant. Uh, and he knew he had to control it, and so he did most of the time. And it did strike me also, if you've got a large guy, and he was very athletic, he was clearly a powerful, physically powerful person. Um, when somebody like that is struggling to maintain their control, That's almost more intimidating than when he loses control. My God, what could happen? Uh, and I wouldn't put it past him to have figured that part out too. So he put himself in situations where he didn't have to have a great speaking voice. Uh, he knew he made a great presentation. He was a big guy. He always dressed perfectly. He looked wonderful. He commanded a room. When he walked in, every eye went to him. And he didn't need to speak. He already had them. So he had great manners, always courteous, and would speak in social niceties. Uh, but he was very cautious about offering his opinion on anything. Uh, and he, advised his younger relatives who wanted to go into public life, never say anything until you're absolutely sure what your position is on it. Um, and I could not find a situation where on a public issue he had to reverse himself. Um, and he could take months before he actually said something on an issue when he was president. And there was this innate caution, which he had learned. He did not trust his initial reaction to facts. He always wanted to reflect on them. So these were things he learned about himself. I think a good deal of that is aging. Um, there's nothing that's quite as educational as being wrong, and you realize I could have played that better. And I think he had a unique quality of self study. Uh, one of his father died when he was very young, but he had a series of mentors through life, and one of them said, uh, George will go to school his whole life. And it just meant he is always watching and always thinking and trying to figure out how to be better. And, that's a great quality.
Did his you could say like he took his time to like really express his opinion. Did this also maybe come from a sense of insecurity maybe about his knowledge as he never was able to go to university and get those, that type of high privilege education?
Very much. He was leading an army against the British Army, which was the finest army of the era. And he had no military training. Uh, we were in the war for almost 3 years before his soldiers were taught how to march. And we had to get a German guy over here to do it. Uh, and so, he read books on how to uh, manage a military situation. But he knew his limitations. And so he was always um, willing to listen. As a military leader, and this carried over into his political life too, um, he really liked to get the smartest people he could in a room and listen to them, whatever decision had to be made. And that, indeed, in the army, he made his commanders write out their opinions so they could never sort of say afterwards, "Well, that's not what I said." Uh, and he would study those submissions, and it was fascinating. In a few instances, I could look where he had, I don't know, 8 or 10 of these opinions from his commanders, and he did not go with the majority view. Uh, he went with the recommendation that made sense to him. Uh, it seemed to me that there were he also paid attention to who the advisor was. It seemed like there were people he respected more. He had one commander, Anthony Wayne, who basically always wanted to attack. Whatever the problem was, let's attack. And so you didn't, you had to understand who he was. And there was another, his second in command, Nathaniel Greene. He clearly respected a great deal. And Greene might be the only person recommending a course of action, and Washington would do that. And, sometimes Washington would just make up his own mind a different way. But he really thought it was important to get as much information as he could. You know, we're swamped with information in this world today. Um, in 1780, it was kind of tough to get information. There were no drones figuring out where the other army was. You had trouble knowing where your guys were, and if you wanted to order troops somewhere, you had to send somebody on horseback with a handwritten order. It was your control was much more limited, and so he was very cautious about that as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I think especially those days, like in order to be a great general, your idea of just your IQ must be very high to like really memorize where all your troops and soldiers are and where also the rival is. You must create like a picture in your head or something like that.
No, I think that's right. They had to understand the land, and that's the most important thing, is to understand the physical setting. And what does the other what forces does the other side have? What are the strengths and weaknesses of your own forces? You're likely to know that. Um, and putting that together and then adapting it as the fighting evolves um, is very difficult, because you may be able to see that the guys out on the left really should attack now, but it takes 40 minutes to get that order over there, and by then maybe they shouldn't. So it was a challenge.
Hmm. I think this fits perfectly to what you wrote in your book too. His excellence came through great effort, not natural superiority. And my question is like, where in Washington's life, like for example, you already said like he wasn't necessarily like a natural in military leadership. Is there any other areas in his life where you see that he wasn't necessarily a natural at it, but because of his insane work ethic, he was able to become really great at it?
Uh, for me, the great example is his self education. He was an inveterate reader. He had a big library of books. He didn't read a lot of novels. He was reading practical books, a lot about agriculture. He had his business was farming, and he needed to understand that. And it was kind of early days for scientific farming. And he also read a great deal about political subjects in history, and he loved travel books. He was so curious about the world. So uh, that was uh, a way every evening, and he also read the newspapers uh, compulsively. Uh, so he had this great curiosity. And one of the features of your question, I think, also is, if you want to, you know, not necessarily be George Washington, but be a leader, you have to be prepared to sacrifice, to work hard. He worked 12-hour days his whole life. And there's no suggestion ever that he thought that was wrong, or that he was, being asked to do too much. He might have preferred a warmer fire and a softer bed, but he, uh, he was willing to put in the time, and I think that unless you are an extraordinarily lucky human being, and there are a few, um, you need to be willing to put in the time.
Yeah. What I'm trying to understand is like where did that extreme work ethic come from? Because as you wrote in your book, like it didn't come from like humble beginnings, right? So this isn't really like a rags to riches story. So it isn't necessarily the terrifying of idea of maybe going back to poverty one day or whatever. I think this must have come from something bigger than himself, right? Like what you already mentioned, like legacy, that's one thing. Maybe love for the country. Like, what do
Yeah,
you think? Like, where did that work ethic come from?
I think uh, he had a couple of close family influences that I think were significant. I mentioned his father died, he was only 7. And his mother raised him and his 4 siblings as a single mother. She never remarried. Money was tight. They weren't poor, but they weren't rich. And that's almost a recipe for ambition because you're well enough off that you know what you don't have. And he was an extraordinarily ambitious man. And I think he imbibed that from his mother. His mother was very religious, and he did not pick that up. He was respectful of religion, but very private about it. Um, but he was motivated from the very beginning. He went to work when he was 16 as a surveyor. The Washingtons had a neighbor family, the Fairfaxes, who were filthy rich. They owned a large chunk of Virginia. And he surveyed a lot of their properties for them. And it's the way he first got money. As a teenager, it was almost, getting a job so you could buy a car. Um, and that was something that was important to him. He also had an older brother, a half brother, much older, 14 years older, who sort of took him under his wing and was a father figure. And his brother Lawrence was a very talented guy too. He died young in his 30s from tuberculosis, and had he lived, George's life might have been very different because Lawrence might have been the big shot Washington, and instead of George. But Lawrence paved his way, and he taught him about how to be in society, how to deal with the powers. Lawrence was the head of an investment syndicate that was developing land. He was involved with Virginia colonial politics, and he taught George. And so George had a model and a caring model. So between his mother, who was a very tough, uh, strong woman, and Lawrence, he had people who cared about him and who pushed him.
And children, especially like the ones he eventually kind of like adopted, how huge did they play a role of maybe like motivating him to create a better country for his descendants?
Yeah, that's a hard one. His stepchildren was a daughter and a son. The daughter died. Was an epileptic, and she died at 15. It was very sad, and he was clearly quite crushed. His stepson um, was a spoiled monster. There's no other way to describe it. He was a very rich guy. His father, uh, uh, John Custis, was very wealthy and had left the money for his own children, and George was simply the man managing the money. Uh, and so uh, Washington was very frustrated with Jack Custis. He Custis would not study. He would not learn. Uh, he Washington's frustrations were clear, and Martha, who was the boy's mother, made it clear that George was not his father, and she was going to raise him, and he should butt out. And uh, people close to the family sort of chuckled about the fact that here was this incredibly powerful guy leading the nation, and he couldn't do much with his stepson. And and the boy dies as a young man. of disease at the end of the Revolutionary War, so that's sad. He leaves 4 children who the Washingtons took care of. Uh, but there was only one male in that group, and he too was sort of a spoiled brat. So uh, his it was often said that, or has been said, that Washington was a great figure for the 18th century in America because there was no risk that he would establish a hereditary monarchy because he had no descendants, which he didn't. Um, and I don't think that was it could have been a motivating force for him. So
Is that something, because you've studied a little of history, like, is that something you see often happen in history, that great men are often not very good in ruling their household in comparison to ruling their country?
well, I think they spend less energy on it, by and large. I mean, this is just a peculiar part of my own experience, but my father worked for one of the children of Franklin Roosevelt, who went into politics and was not very successful, Franklin Roosevelt Jr. And my father made it clear that, he just wasn't prepared to work hard, was, a nice enough fellow, kind of thoughtless about other people, uh, and didn't have the drive because it had all been handed to him. He was a celebrity when he was 6 years old. So I think it's not uncommon that the children of great people uh, simply uh, don't rise to that. And some of it may be that a form of neglect. Some of it may be a sense of it's too much to ask of them. I, People are different. There's folks who want to, in any family, there's not everybody wants to do the same thing. Uh, so it's not uncommon for children to go in another direction. I think certainly when your parent has been a huge historic figure, that's a burden, and it's not easy to deal with.
Yeah, I think it's more a burden than a gift. I think the standard is also way too high for you. Like, you could become the CEO of a bank, but you'll still be compared to a
Right.
founding father. So it will never be good enough. You wrote in your book that after early failures, he chose to reinvent himself. So there are two things that stood out to me is, first of all, early. So early failures, as he did make some early mistakes, but also that reinvent himself. So could we get into both of those two terms? Like, what do you mean with early failures? Like, could you give me some examples of mistakes he made early in his career? But also, what do you mean with reinvent himself? Like, what did that look like?
Sure, the failures were in what we call the French and Indian War, and in Europe it's called the 7 Years' War, which was in America, it was between the British and the French. And he led a group of Virginians who were fighting for the British, and he uh, was unsuccessful. They mostly were fighting against Indians in the forest. Uh, Indians were incredibly good at fighting in the forest. They lived in the forest. The Virginians were clumsy and noisy and not smart about it. And he spent 3 years basically losing. Not in big battles, just, 3 guys got killed today. Next week it'd be 4 others. Ambushes, people burned out of their homes. And it was relentless. And he was a young man. He was in his early 20s, very ambitious, and he reacted very badly, as you might, to all this failure. Uh, and he then made it. And I don't hold him accountable for any of that. That was the situation. He was going to lose. Anybody there was going to lose. But he got nasty, and he started picking fights with his superiors within the military, and particularly with the governor of Virginia, who had really done him a lot of favors. Uh, and it was stupid. It was just, he was in a terrible way, and he made bad choices. And he ultimately then resigned from that position and went home. Uh, he also was sick at the time. And he, I think, took enough time to realize that this was not going well, was not going to go well, that he had fouled the nest. It's the phrase we use. And he decided to do something else. And there's no written statement by him to that effect, but you can see that that's what he did. He courted Martha Custis and won her hand in marriage. She was this very wealthy widow about his age, won her hand in marriage in like a 2-week period. It was a whirlwind courtship. And he had the property from his brother Lawrence, which became Mount Vernon, which was his treasured home. And he retired there, basically. He was 27. I mean, it's not that he stopped working, but he moved there with Martha, and that became his focus. And he immediately ran for public office. And he left, he always would want to be a soldier, and he went back to soldiering. But that road was closed off to him. The British didn't want him. The British thought Americans were all bozos and, really needed to go learn French. And so he decided to rise and really mimicking what his brother Lawrence was doing within the American context, and became a politician. And for 15 years, that was his life, along with his farming at Mount Vernon. And that's when he rises to significance. He makes his way in a very different world. And that's what I mean by reinvention. And I think people do that. And I think, frankly, these days, you need to be able to do that. I've done it a couple of times in my life. And you need to understand sometimes maybe you're not doing something very well because you don't like it. And there might be something you would do better. And that, I think Washington, unusually, but did figure that out.
Do you think he was a better match for the political life in comparison to the soldier life?
Uh, there's military historians love to dump on Washington because, in fact, as a commander, he made some mistakes. And the longer he was a commander, just to be crude, he didn't get tremendously better. He had good innings and he had bad innings. So I think he actually was a better political leader. But there were qualities he brought to his military leadership which were terribly important and were inspirational. And we tend to gloss over this sometimes. I think earlier histories did not. He was insanely brave. Soldiers respect that. You go to a battle, you may well die. It's really terrifying. And Washington never backed down. He was crazy lucky. He was never got a scratch. And he would emerge from the battle with bullet holes in his coat and in his hat. He faced as much danger as anybody on the field, even when he was a general. And that is something his fellow soldiers always respected. And That was a form of leadership that was more important in those days than it is today. Today, it's much more technological. Um, but uh, so it's not that he was an inept military leader. He was not a brilliant military leader. I think as a political leader, for his time, he was pretty close to brilliant.
Mm. Yeah, I want to get into that political, the way he moved in politics too in a second. But what you also wrote in your book is that at Valley Forge, he stayed with his men and listened. Valley Forge, if I'm correct, is an was a moment in his career that didn't go well. Correct? That was one of the key moments of, you could say, kind of like a decline or a mistake.
Well, they had spent the year before. There had only been two battles, and they'd lost both of them. And there was the custom in the 18th century that you would not fight the war in the winter. It was very gentlemanly. So they went into camp outside of Philadelphia, and it was a North American winter. It was cold. It was not the coldest winter on record, but it was hard. And the soldiers were in terrible shape. They didn't have enough uniforms. They didn't have shoes. Um, they had to build their own shelters, and they got sick. About 1,000 of them died of disease, and it was grim. It was just a grim 3 or 4 months. And Washington every day would leave his headquarters, on his horse, and with an aide would ride through the camp and talk to the men, show them him, show himself to them, that he was still there. He was still leading them as he could. If there was something he could fix, there's a dead horse carcass in the middle of the path. Well, that could be moved. He would make that happen. He would try to improve their lives in little ways. And it was a form of leadership which is intensely personal. And I think he understood that. There's a management guru named Tom Peters who 20 years ago described it as management by walking around. You can't lead an organization unless you actually see what they're doing and you see what the people look like. What talk to them. I've just been working on a project about our World War II General George Patton, and he insisted that he had to go to the front, and it was a time when generals didn't do that, and he took risks. But he said, "I need to see the men. If I can look in their faces, I can see how much more they can take. And if I don't see them, I don't know that." And I think that form of personal connection is extremely valuable, and I think it may account in large part for the time, the long time Washington was the American leader. He had that ability to just show up, always be there, and do what he could. And as miserable as they were, the soldiers understood that he was doing what he could, and they appreciated that.
Mm-hmm. Is that something you see often in the figures you've studied? Is that they think often about the morale of the soldiers because their decision making will be better than too, because I can imagine it's hard to make decisions if you don't know how your soldiers are feeling at that moment, like what's the morale like of the army. Same with, I mean, you can even find it in like founders, entrepreneurs, like knowing the morale of your employees, and from that information you can make way better decisions, correct?
Absolutely. You once you're trying to do something large, you need other people to help, and that you can only judge their capabilities by knowing them and by understanding what they can do and what they can't do. And you know, you don't get that sitting in your office. I always I practiced law for many years and was involved with many organizations as representing them, and I always cringed when a leader would say, "I have an open door policy." It's a terrible idea. You may have an open door, but nobody's going through it. You need to get out that door. You need to go through the door and go find out what's happening. That's your job. It's not their job to come tell you, and they're not gonna. So uh, I think Washington understood that.
Yeah, I think many leaders, failed leaders, might believe that they are maybe even too good to speak to the common soldier, to even take the time for that, and they should spend most of their time on more the tactical side of winning the war, winning the battle, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to worry about when you're leading an army. There's the logistics are horrible, and just feeding them is impossible, and trying to keep them healthy. So there is a great deal to pay attention to, but uh, you can't overlook the human part. Again, I have George Patton on my mind, but he always insisted that his soldiers salute correctly. And he was a real pain in the neck about it. He would fine people for not saluting correctly. And he said once, well, if you can't get them to salute, how are you going to get them to die for their country? And,
Good point.
yeah, I mean, you need to have that shared understanding of what you're about.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like the thing that all the USA soldiers always need to make their bed, right? Before battle. Like, make sure they make their bed, make sure they salute well. So the basics are done. And then from the basics, if the whole army does that, I can imagine it's very hard for morale to be quite low.
Well, it's a complicated thing, but discipline is the basis of any organization.
Mm-hmm. You wrote, he endured setbacks, worked with diverse leaders, and kept support. How was he able to maintain some form of loyalty from his units during these hard times? You mentioned like the visiting them was also like a part of it, maybe like promising them something or anything else.
Well, I might turn that around. I think a lot of it was telling them the truth and not promising things he couldn't deliver. When he's riding around the Valley Forge camp, I imagine he said, we're trying hard to get some more food here. We know you need more food. I don't think he said, we'll have a hot meal for you at lunchtime, because he didn't know that. And you don't want to get hopes up and then disappointed, and then you're the liar. You're the one who can't be trusted. So you don't sugarcoat things. You tell people the truth, and uh, that's important.
Did he share their sufferings? Like you see, for example, with Alexander the Great, that during these very difficult times, that even he wouldn't drink a drop of water. Is that something Washington also did?
Well, he was the commander in chief, and he was in his late 40s and early 50s. So I don't think anybody resented him, sleeping in a tent.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, uh, he rode the horse himself. He was a great horseman, and so he would, but he wasn't marching. He wasn't, he was the commander. He had a few privileges, but he also was out there. It was very cold and it was raining, and he was out there with them when they went across the Delaware River to the Battle of Trenton. He was out there in the snow with them, and that is part of leadership. You do have to share some of the hard times, and I think he succeeded with that. He was It's a fascinating thing. Through his life, he got sick a good deal. He had several serious bouts of illness, but not when he was leading the army. Not when he was really uh, killing himself every day and in rough conditions. Uh, and he responded to those challenges.
Mm. Yeah, maybe his body knew that at this moment it wasn't the right time to become sick because there's no tea or honey at the current war camp.
Yeah, it's one of those puzzles.
Mm-hmm. Let's get into like the political side of him because that's also like a big part of your book. It's often like something what I've heard is that historians don't often talk or at least undervalue his political genius. Um, let's get into like the reading part, reading people part. So you wrote in your book, he read people well, masking deep observations with courtesy. How good were George Washington's reading people skills, would you say?
My favorite example of this is when the country was sliding into the revolution. Uh, he was elected to the First Continental Congress, the first time delegates came from all over the country, the 13 colonies. And they had things to do and petitions to draw up and plans to make and issues to argue about. And they had a couple of committees that did important work, and Washington didn't do any of that. uh, those were things, giving speeches and writing up petitions, and he wasn't going to be great at that. Uh, but he did do was he went out to dinner. Uh, and it was in Philadelphia, which was our big city at the time. And he was at dinner every night. And it was a great event for the city to have this Congress going on. So all of the wealthy people would compete to have the delegates come to their home. And Washington was out every night and being commanding, being sober and impressive and beautifully dressed. And
Yeah, that's something that was very important to him, right? The way he dressed.
very much. And it's interesting. It's something he shared with Patton. Patton insisted on that too. And making a fabulous impression on people, an impression of strength. Uh, and, you know, you have to see it for what it was. He knew there was going to be a war, and he wanted to be a leader in that war. And he wasn't going to be picked to be the leader at the war by giving a great speech. He needed to convey an image of strength, of determination, and he was always one of the most aggressive people supporting war in the country. And by persuading people that he was a serious person, that he would see this through. And so he did that. And a few months later, they come back in the Second Continental Congress, and we're going to war. There's an army in Boston. And he shows up at the Congress wearing a military uniform. It was his Virginia militia uniform, but he was the only guy in the room wearing a uniform. And my reaction was, geez, they must have thought that was kind of strange, but nobody seems to have. They wrote, the other delegates wrote letters home, and they tended to write about Washington and say, well, he's an impressive guy. And nobody said, yeah, but he is always wearing this crazy uniform. And he knew, he understood in a way that I wouldn't have, that would convey, again, his seriousness, his willingness to sacrifice, his willingness to go be with the army and to take those chances. And this time he spoke more. He took, because it was military issues. And in the middle of the congressional session, he's unanimously chosen commander in chief. And his military record until that moment was pretty spotty. He hadn't done very well until then, but he had played it just right. There were other factors that worked in his favor, but that, to me, was a fellow who, the phrase we use today is he could read the room. He understood people's reaction to him. He knew that he could inspire trust, that he can inspire people just by his calm, his size, his looking terrific, uh, his caution and deliberation. And when he spoke on military subjects, compared to some of the people at that Congress, he knew something. He had led men in war. So that, for me, showed that he could understand the situation and the reactions of the people around him. There's feedback around us all the time. When you go to the store, there's feedback. How are people responding to you? Do you pay attention to that? You may not care. It's a casual encounter. But if you're a leader, you do care. And you need to hear that. And something I know you paid attention to was he was always interested in people telling him what other people were saying. They didn't have mass media. They didn't have polling organizations. But he wanted to hear what the scuttlebutt was. What were they saying down at the barber shop? And that was important. So he could figure out, and I love this phrase he used, if his policies were good or bad, or if he just needed to explain them better. And that's, we sort of pass that off these days as spin. How do you present an issue? But it's also a true priority. You need to explain what you're doing in a way that people understand. I mean, I'll take a chance and use a modern equivalent. We are in the midst of tariff madness right now, and one of the big problems is nobody really understands what the heck we're doing. And if there's an explanation, it hasn't been offered. And that's very hard on people.
Yeah. I think it's easier for people to suffer through hard times if they know why they're doing it. So the
Yes.
tariffs would be explained by Trump, for example, in a easy to understand manner instead of like the economic difficult words manner, then I think it would have a way more positive and optimistic effect on the American civil audience.
Yeah, one of the most controversial issues Washington dealt with as president was the Jay Treaty, which was a treaty with Britain uh, during the beginning of the wars over the French Revolution. Those wars went on for 20 years. And we were in trouble with both Britain and France. They both were taking advantage of our ships, and we didn't have a navy. And so Washington wanted some kind of treaty with Britain, but Britain didn't much care about us. We didn't have any military strength. We had no navy. So the treaty was kind of crummy. It wasn't very good for the United States. And Washington, I think, and the reaction to it when it was first disclosed was great opposition. The Mr. J, who negotiated the treaty, was burned in effigy in every city in America. And he joked at one point that he could walk the length of the East Coast at night lit by the fires of his burning effigies. But so Washington waited, and he didn't do anything for a long while. He had to decide whether to sign it, and he waited months and months. And then finally, he decided it was the best deal we were going to get, and having it was better than not having it. So he announced he would sign it in very simple terms. And he just said, I have studied this situation and this treaty. I believe it is constitutional and within our powers, and it is the best course for us. And all the air went out of the opposition. And he'd been straight, as straight as he could be. And he had waited for some of the passion to subside. The part of being a politician is understanding timing. And he understood the timing on that one. So it's all part of the political job.
He wasn't educated in the highest level. So do you think like maybe that helped him in communicating better with the average person on pure like on the language barrier? Because often like very educated people, and I can imagine like a Benjamin Franklin with probably like an IQ over 140, is difficult to understand what he's trying to say because they're using such complex terms. But in comparison to George Washington, he might have a better understanding of what the basic language level is of the average American.
I might turn that a little. I think he had a very direct way of addressing issues, which was smart and was something that people responded to. I think we did have some leaders, most obvious one being James Madison, who was a terrific figure, but he was very intellectual and he could uh, write a very complicated sentence that you had to read a few times to figure out. Uh, so there is an element that you can there's a risk you over intellectualize a situation. And you do need to speak directly to people. But Washington also cherished uh, people who could write well, and he recruited them to help him. The greatest example is Alexander Hamilton, who was a gifted writer. And he actually used Madison for the same function some of the time. And before that, as a younger man, he had allied with George Mason, who was a fellow Virginian. And with all three of these people, it was their ability to express themselves in writing that was the most important thing to Washington. And he did not trust himself to produce a polished written product.
Well, that's also a sign of intellect, like knowing what your flaws are, knowing what you're not good at. You also wrote in your book, he sought out criticism to improve himself. And you also just mentioned it a couple minutes ago about how he was also always looking for feedback. Do you see that often in the leaders that you study, as in that they're hungry for new information, new feedback, new criticism, ways they can improve their systems, their communication, or anything else?
Yes, I think uh, you need to, certainly in the political world, you need to understand how events are being understood by the people you're accountable to. Um, and again, Washington's formulation, is the policy wrong or am I explaining it badly? Um, is the question you need to answer, and that's uh, that's central to the whole political uh, equation. In a system of self-government, which we've had until now, it, it, it's all about public opinion. That's what drives a modern democratic republic. And if you don't know what the public opinion is, you're stumbling in the dark. And even back in the 1780s and 1790s, when it was hard to gauge public opinion, but there were newspapers, there were people talking and writing letters. The letters were very important from people in the community. Uh, you could tell. I mean, when the Jay Treaty was a terrifically controversial issue, communities all across the country adopted resolutions denouncing it. He didn't have to wonder, was it controversial? And after about 6 months, there was a change, and they stopped doing that. And you started seeing the odd resolutions saying, well, it's the best we can do. So there were ways to pick up the information they needed, and Washington used them.
Mm. And how did he know if criticism, and this is like more than the individual level, how did he know like if a criticism or opinion of someone was worth listening to?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? He, uh, he certainly knew that there were communities, parts of the country, which may have been more susceptible to his message and others that were not. We can see that today. We have our blue state and red state distinctions in this country. I assume in every country that's like that. I know in Britain, the North has always been more labor-oriented, and the South more conservative. So you have to understand where the feedback is coming from. But it's still feedback, and it's still maybe they're saying it out loud, but maybe the people who are on your side are thinking it quietly. And it's worth paying attention to everything that's about what you're doing.
Mm. To wrap up this conversation, what is the one thing that surprised you about George Washington when doing the research for this book?
Uh, you know, that he was, I know this sounds sort of corny, uh, that he was actually great. We, in this country, we have had a reckoning for some years with the issue of slavery in our founding. And Washington was a slave owner, a slave master. And it took him a while to understand how bad it was. As a young man, he was impervious to it, which is hard to imagine, but he was. And by the end of his life, he knew it was wrong, and he had done terrible crime. And he tried to atone for it, freed the slaves he could freed in his will. And so there is a tendency now to say, oh, well, he's just a slave owner. We should pay no attention to him. We should not honor him. And I think that's wrong. He lived in his time. What do we do today that people 200 or 300 years from now will look back and say, what was wrong with those people? What they were polluting the planet to an unbelievable degree. They were eating animals. I mean, who eats animals? They were still killing each other in wars. How crazy was that? So, that's something we have to be clear-eyed about. He was on the wrong side of slavery. He tried to repair it, but not in a very effective way. He was our greatest leader, and he failed that moral test. So be it. But the things he achieved were extraordinary and were essential to the country. And that really is my lasting impression, is he actually was great.